have been looking forward to this moment for a while, and I even wore red for the heart. Today I'm going to be talking about floating from the heart and that really long byline that I wrote for some reason, understanding the relationship between biomarkers of cardiac activity and flotation rest. What I'm really here to talk about is how amazing the signals we get from the heart are, and how all of the research that's gone on so far and things that you heard about yesterday is so incredibly cool. And so to start, I want everyone to think about the last time that you were in a float tank. Or maybe better, think about the first time you were in a float tank. And as the tank door or the pod top closed and you were suddenly immersed in darkness, what do you remember noticing? What was different about that experience? One of the things you probably noticed was your breathing, feeling your lungs expand and contract, your chest rise and fall. But in addition to that, maybe after a few minutes or a few seconds, you probably started to notice your heart. That heartbeat that is with us for every second, every minute of every day, from birth to death, that we so often don't pay attention to, that we never listen to. And yet in a float tank, it's there. It surrounds us. And I'm here to tell you that that heartbeat is speaking a language all on its own. And that language is kind of like a song. And I'm not stretching the metaphor that much here. Today I'm going to tell you that there is actually kind of a reason that the heartbeat is kind of speaking. And I mean that in the sense of how we actually speak. So when we talk, our vocal cords vibrate. And that vibration vibrates air molecules, and it gets spread across space. And if you're listening to those vibrations, your ear picks up those vibrations, they go into your cochlea, it gets decoded by your brain, and we understand the frequencies that are in the air around us. And now in the same way that frequencies make up our speech, frequencies also make up our heartbeat. And we measure this in a variety of different ways. One way that I'll talk a little bit more about is an EKG, which is able to pick up the electrical signal that creates our heartbeat. And if you listen to those signals, you are hearing music. You're hearing the heart song. Roy, is that a good enough analogy? Did I win? Compared to your elephant? Yeah, in the same way that if you're listening to an opera, if you're listening to Wagner, it may be very beautiful, but you don't exactly know what is being said unless you know German. We need to talk about how to understand the heart song. And I just happen to be pretty fluent in heart song myself, so I'll be able to walk everyone through it today. In order to do that, we're going to have to talk about things in the frequency domain. And I wanted to do this talk because I've been working in the frequency domain in a lot of different ways over the past 8 years, and it is so confusing. And so part of this was actually me trying to figure it out myself. So we're going to be learning together. And the really amazing thing is that looking at the heart, understanding these frequencies, can really give us a key into understanding holistic health in general. And then, of course, by extension, seeing how flotation affects heart frequencies can give us a clue into the ways that flotation is helping our whole health. And so now, to help us to understand frequencies, before I really get into the data, which I'll talk about at the end, I want to kind of use a bit of an analogy. It's still heart rate, but all of us kind of measure our heart rate. We've become very familiar with this with wearables. I'm wearing my Apple Watch right now. You can kind of look and take a look and see what your heart rate is at any moment of the day. And what you may find, if you've paid attention to it, is that your heart rate varies across the entire day. You may have a resting heart rate. You may have a faster heart rate when you're moving a lot. When you're sitting down, your heart rate's probably lower. And I want to talk about those changes in heart rate. And I want to talk about them on 3 different time scales. Short term, over the course of minutes or an hour. A long term, over the course of like a day. and the very long term over the course of a calendar year. And so what exactly do I mean by this? Well, let's take a look at this, and I'm going to have this graph right here. And I promise it's not that scary. It's going to change a little bit depending on our time frame, but to start off, we're going to be looking at activity over the course of an hour. And so along the bottom of the graph here, we're going to see minutes. So it goes from 0 to 60, so we're covering maybe the course of an entire hour. And then on the up and down axis of this graph, we're going to be taking a look at heart activity. And so anything that's near the top is going to be high activity, and anything that's near the bottom is going to be low activity. So let's think about a couple different scenarios about how your heart might change depending on situation. Now, if you're like me, you're probably fighting a hangover because the party was really awesome last night. And maybe you drank way too much coffee trying to offset that hangover. And so if you had a lot of coffee, you might be super jittery right now. And you might be constantly getting up out of your seat. Maybe you're somewhat vibrating. And so if we were to think about this in a frequency term, it might look something like this, in that you get up, your heart rate goes up, you run around for a bit, then you come back and sit back down, your heart rate goes back down. But then 2 seconds later, you get back up, your heart rate goes back up and down and up and down and up and down and up and down and up and down. And so we can see that there's this very high frequency of change in your heart rate based off of kind of the fact that you had caffeine. But say you didn't have caffeine, but maybe you're just kind of a fidgety person. Maybe you really have a hard time sitting down for long periods of time. So maybe your frequency would look like this, in which case you would have periods in which you got up, and then periods in which you were sitting down, and your heart rate would kind of go up to help you to move more, and then it would go back down to bring you and maintain homeostasis. And then maybe you're sick. Maybe you have a cold, which really sucks on a conference, but you're not moving all of that much, and you're kind of conserving your energy, and so you're really only moving a little bit at some points, but then a lot of the time you're also just kind of not moving at all. And so when you're moving, your heart rate's kind of struggling to keep you going, and then you kind of sit back down and everything calms down. And we can think about this as all different frequencies within this short-term time frame. But now I want to switch to the next time frame. And so let's talk about during the day, so long term. Now, as humans, and really most animals on the planet, we have a 24-hour rhythm. And that rhythm is maintained by a clock that's in our brain, by cortisol in our bloodstream, and it allows us to have this pretty even general activity level, in which during the evening, we're often asleep, and so we're not moving as much, our heart rate is lower, whereas during the day, we're moving around, we're doing things, we're getting things done, and so overall, our heart rate's going to be a little bit more elevated. Now, the location of this curve can change depending on the kind of person you are. So for example, we call some people larks in the circadian rhythm field. And larks are individuals who really like to get up early, and they do things earlier than most people. So you would see a shift of this curve kind of backwards, showing that this peak of activity might be occurring a lot earlier because you're getting things done earlier. And we also have things called owls. And night owls are people that are the opposite. They're people that have more activity at night. And so their peak of activity, their peak of heart rate, is probably going to be occurring a bit later in the day, and they're going to be staying up later. Now, in addition to this, as I mentioned, we all have our own 24-hour clock that is running in our brain. But there are certain people that actually have a clock that is not running at 24 hours. It's fairly rare. It's a sleep-wake disorder, a circadian rhythm disorder. And in these cases, you might actually see that this curve gets warped. And so for individuals who have a daily rhythm inside of them that is lasting for less than 24 hours, it might end up looking something like this. And if someone had a daily rhythm that was lasting for more than 24 hours, their frequency might look something like this. These are incredibly difficult disorders to live with because you end up constantly catching up when you're dealing with the regular daily cycle. But it's in the same way, we can take a look at frequencies, and we can shift their length, we can compress them, we can also move them around depending on what's going on, and all of this information is incredibly valuable when we're looking at understanding a person's heart rate over time. And I'd like to give one more example, and we could think about this at an even different time scale. And that's this very long term. So down here along the bottom, we now have months as opposed to hours or minutes. And generally, we have kind of a rhythm based off of the amount of light that is available on the planet. And if you live near the equator, your rhythms might look something like this. Because basically in the summer months, we have a little bit more light, and so you're going to be more active, which means your heart rate's going to be up more frequently. And then in the winter months, you're going to be a little less active because the days are shorter, and so you're not going to be up as much. However, if you go to northern latitudes, really far north, in which these extremes of light are huge, as far north as Alaska, perhaps, where we have periods of time where you have almost complete 24 hours of daylight or almost complete 24 hours of darkness, what you're going to see is a shift in this curve in its amplitude. And in this case, when the days are much longer, you're going to have a lot more activity going on. You're going to have a heart rate that's going to be up more frequently because you're going to have a lot more light than people would at the equator. And so it can kind of, again, shift the shape of this curve based off of circumstances and what's going on. Now, the really interesting thing about this is that when we measure frequencies like this, we're not really isolating each individual one. They're kind of all occurring at once. And so, depending on when you measure someone's frequencies, of their heart rate, you might be getting the short-term frequencies and the long-term frequencies. And if you measure for long enough, you may be able to capture these very long-term frequencies. But it's going to look a little different. And so let me explain by what I mean, because this is kind of crucial to understanding how we look at frequency information. So let's start with the very long-term kind of at the base. So if this is an example of a rhythm that someone would have over the course of a year, what would it look like if we suddenly layered on top of that the rhythms that an individual had over the course of a day? And what kind of happens is that they get layered. And we suddenly have these complex frequencies that we're measuring that show kind of these daily rhythms in each of these little up-down peaks, but they're layered on top of this very large yearly rhythm. And so it creates this complex frequency. But not only that, but you can add on top of that frequencies that occur over the course of a day. So let's zoom a little bit on this. And let's then add on top of that those daily rhythms, like whether you had too much coffee or whether you're sick. And when you layer those on top, you get frequencies that are even more complex. And so what happens is that when we measure frequencies, whether you're talking about heart rate or the activity of neurons or anything else that has periodicity like this, we end up getting these complex frequencies that look something like this. And as scientists, it's our job to use math to basically break it apart and try and get all of the underlying frequencies that are going on that are all happening at once. And I know that sounds really complicated, and in fact, it is really complicated, but it's also something everyone in this room does every single day of their life without ever thinking. Because that's what we do when we're picking out a single voice from a crowd. When you're in a loud, noisy room and you're hearing a bunch of different people talking, you're getting a bunch of different frequencies that are now all layered on top of each other. And that frequency that gets interpreted by your ear is then decomposed in a very complicated but elegant way in your brain to allow you to pick out a single voice in a crowd. And I wanted to say that just to help you to realize that we work with frequencies all the time, even if we're not scientists. But as scientists, we do a little bit of extra work so that we can figure this stuff out. But let's get back to the heart. So kind of, again, bringing this back to the EKG, to measuring the heartbeat. And so now we're talking not necessarily about changes in heart rate, but actual changes in the beating of your heart that we're able to measure using an EKG. And it does this by measuring the electrical activity that is controlling your heartbeat every single time your heartbeat moves. And that signal that we're getting from an EKG can then be decomposed into several different frequency ranges. high frequencies, low frequencies, very low frequencies, in the same way that we decomposed heart rate earlier, depending on the time of day. Now, when we're talking about this in the context of the heart, these frequencies have actually been defined. And just to give you an idea of what these frequency levels are, I'm going to be talking in terms of hertz. So hertz is 1 cycle per second, and that is our general measurement that we use in science when we're trying to understand anything that occurs over time. And so when we look at each of these different frequency ranges, for the high frequency range in heart rate, we're dealing with about 0.15 to 0.4 hertz. And what that functionally means is that's about 1 cycle every 2 to 7 seconds. And we're covering all frequencies kind of within that range. And then for low frequencies, when it comes to heart rate, we're dealing with 0.04 to 0.15 hertz, which is about 1 cycle every 7 to 30 seconds. And it might look something like that. And then in the very low frequency range, we're talking about frequencies in the range of 0.0033 to 0.04 hertz, which is about 1 cycle every 30 seconds to 5 minutes. And what you may notice is that these lengths of time are pretty long. And it has to do with the fact that the body controls the heart rate over longer periods of time than just a single heartbeat. And so these frequencies all go into understanding this song of the heart. It's like the heart is speaking to us. And then from this frequency information and with other measurements, we can take into account other measurements of the heart that all go into this song. And that includes things like blood pressure and heart rate variability, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit, because that's a cool concept, but it's a little confusing. And so when you take all of these different aspects of the heart's language into account, we're really not just learning about the health of the heart, but we're getting an insight into the health of the entire body. Now, what exactly do I mean by that? And how does that work? Well, to do that, we're going to have to ditch the cartoon for a minute and go to some anatomical drawings of the heart. But I still tried to make them look cute, so. So the heartbeat is, integral to life. We need a heartbeat to keep going. And so the body has a variety of systems to maintain that heartbeat. And at its base level, we have the heart's pacemaker. Now, the heart's pacemaker is made up of 2 different nodes that create the electricity that helps the heartbeat, called the sinoatrial node and the atrioventricular node. And those names aren't super important, but the SA node is kind of one of the main parts of the pacemaker that then transfers electrical activity to the AV node and then keeps your heart beating. And on its own, without any input from the body, this heartbeat would be about 100 beats per minute. Now, for most of us, that's a little fast. And so in order for our heartbeat to be regulated, to really respond to what we need to do in life, there are other systems of the body that talk to the heart to help to change the way that it beats. And you may be familiar with some of those body systems, particularly if you've been paying attention at the conference. One of them is one I talked a lot about last year, the sympathetic nervous system. And the other is the other branch of the autonomic nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system. And these 2 systems of the body have kind of differing control over heartbeat. The sympathetic nervous system tends to speed things up. It helps kind of quicken the heart rate, get us ready for action. Whereas the parasympathetic nervous system acts in the opposite way, and it slows the heartbeat down. It helps to keep us in a place of balance. And when we think about this responsiveness, our ability to use our nervous system to make a decision about how we need our heart rate to react to our current circumstance, that is, in essence, what heart rate variability is. And heart rate variability is a really good thing. It's kind of complicated, mainly because I can't sit here and tell you good, like high heart rate variability is good or low heart rate variability is good. Usually we want diverse heart rate variability. We want to be able to respond to our environment in a way that's adaptive. And so we want our heart rate to be able to change to help us to really adjust to whatever type of experiences that we have. And so having increased heart rate variability ends up being kind of a metric that's associated with health. However, it is very situationally dependent. And let's talk a little bit about those two systems that lead to that heart rate variability. So you may remember the sympathetic nervous system from my talk last year. We had our friendly saber-toothed tiger who was attacking Clara. And this sympathetic nervous system is also known as the fight or flight system because it helps to get us prepared for action, whether we need to fight something off or flee the scene, or even just waking up in the morning. Sympathetic nervous system helps to get us going. And the sympathetic nervous system, the activity is mainly in the low frequency range. Now, I know this sounds a little weird because I just said that the sympathetic nervous system speeds up the heart, but it does so in a slower way than the parasympathetic nervous system. And when I'm saying slow, we're not talking about really slow. We're talking about a couple seconds here. But the sympathetic nervous system just has a bit of a slower route to get to the heart than the parasympathetic nervous system does. And so that's why its activity is more reflected in some of these low frequencies. But let's talk briefly about the parasympathetic nervous system. The parasympathetic nervous system is about keeping us in balance when we are not rushing off to do things. It's about what we call homeostasis, really kind of maintaining that balance. And it's also known as the rest and digest system, or the feed and breathe system, but I couldn't really figure out conference-appropriate pictures that would match that, so. Now, the parasympathetic nervous system is very involved in heart rate, and it does this across a lot of different frequencies, which starts to muddy the waters here a bit. So it works on very high frequencies. It actually has the ability to kind of change the direction of your heartbeat in between beats, which is super cool. But it also works at lower frequencies. And so trying to figure out what these frequencies are telling us can get pretty complicated because there's a huge amount of overlap between the body systems that kind of provide input that happens at these different frequencies. And one of the ways that we work to try to understand that is by doing different transformations of this frequency information that correlate with specific processes that happen in the body. And one of those processes is called the respiratory sinus arrhythmia. And this is occurring every day of your life with every breath. It involves the heart, it involves the lungs, and it is a way of modulating the heart's activity in response to breathing. And it does this by activating pulmonary stretch receptors that respond to when your diaphragm expands every time you breathe in or contracts when you exhale. And it also coordinates with aortic baroreceptors, which are stretch receptors that occur, that are placed in the aorta and kind of respond to changes in blood pressure. And there are small changes in blood pressure that occur whenever we breathe in or out. And this information from these receptors travels to the brain, to the solitary nucleus of the brainstem, and then it sends a signal back. And it sends a signal back through a nerve called the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve is incredibly important in the parasympathetic nervous system. It is one of the major highways of the PNS, and understanding activity on the vagus nerve can actually be really informative in a lot of different ways. And what this does is that it modifies the heartbeat based off of your breathing. And so if you remember what I said, that the parasympathetic nervous system slows down the heart rate. So when you breathe in, or inspiration, it decreases activity along the vagus nerve, and it allows your heart rate to speed up. And then when you breathe out, the activity along the vagus nerve increases, and your heart rate slows down. Now, amazingly, we've known about the respiratory sinus arrhythmia for decades, and we still don't quite know exactly why it happens. We think that it might have to do with carbon dioxide balance in the blood. There's a few different types of hypotheses, But what we do know is that it gives us a really great understanding of something called vagal tone. And vagal tone is an approximation of the activity of the vagus nerve when you're at rest, when nothing is happening. And the quality of that vagal tone has been connected to a variety of different outcome measures that have to do with brain health, activity, and the body. And specifically, understanding vagal tone has been related to cognition, the way that we think. It's even been related to social behavior and the way that we interact with others, and the different disorders that can kind of come with both of those things. And, together with that, when we take a look at heart rate variability, in a couple different measures, we have many different ways to look at heart rate variability, but decreased heart rate variability has been associated with a variety of different mood disorders, and it's even been connected to autism. And so, by just learning to speak this language of the heart, we can gain so much insight into all of these different processes and different conditions that we're dealing with. But I know you're here because of floating. So how does floating shift the language of the heart? What does it do? Well, I'm going to be talking about a study which has been covered a few other times. It was done at LIBOR, Laureate Institute for Brain Research, Dr. Justin Feinstein, and we used our open pool. We worked with both anxious and healthy patients, anxious patients and healthy controls. We had about 57 people in the study, and the data that I'm going to present to you is pooled between both the anxious and the healthy individuals, because what we found is something that really crosses across the lines of any mental health condition and can be, seems to, at least in this study, work in people no matter what their anxiety state is. The study involved a float condition and a earth condition. Just to recap the study, we had people come in, they did one of the, either floated for 90 minutes or they watched a 90-minute nature documentary that had all the sex and violence edited out, so it was a lot less it was more calm. And they would float for 90 minutes, watch the film for 90 minutes, we'd have about a week washout period in between, and then they'd come back and they'd do the other thing. And in that way, we were able to kind of get the same response in each subject, looking at each different condition. And what was really special about this experiment is that we were able to really innovate into wireless and waterproof technologies that allowed us to get EKG data and blood pressure data while individuals were in the pool floating, which is a huge accomplishment and has been really amazing in getting this data. And you've seen some of the results of this in Justin's talk, in Saib's talk. It's really cool. And so I'm going to flash up a bunch of the data at first, and then I'm going to walk you through some of it. We looked at a lot of different measures of heart rate variability in the frequency domain, blood pressure, and we found some really interesting things. So first to talk in that frequency domain, since we spent so much time trying to understand that. So these graphs showed time along the bottom axis, and this is the time that the individual is either watching the video or in the pool. And the orange line corresponds to watching the video, whereas the blue line corresponds to being in the float session. And then the up and down axes are really complicated to explain, so don't worry about them, but they're just the magnitude of the effect. And what we can see here is that in terms of the high frequencies, individuals in a float condition had higher high-frequency signals than individuals in the film condition. And if we remember, the high frequency was really pretty strongly associated with the parasympathetic nervous system. And so this is saying that they're having increased, well, this is suggesting that they may be having increased parasympathetic nervous system activity, which would be consistent with a relaxation response. Oops, go back. There we go. And then we look at the low frequencies. And remember, this one's a little more complicated because the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system both contribute to low frequency. But we see a decrease in these low frequency signals. And that, again, would potentially suggest that we might be seeing decreased sympathetic nervous system activity, decreased fight or flight, again, more of a relaxation response. And then one of the really interesting things that we're all kind of scratching our heads over is this very low frequency category. No one in the field of heart rate variability can really come to a consensus about what's going on here. But what I can tell you is that there's a massive decrease in very low frequency information in floating as compared to pool, or as compared to the film. So hopefully someday we'll figure out what that means. But for now, it's a really interesting head scratcher. We also had a change in a measure of heart rate variability. This measure is referred to as the SDNN. It stands for standard deviation of normal to normal beats. I would need another hour to really explain that, but you can think about it kind of as a measure generally of heart rate variability. It's also kind of related to cognition in some literature, depending on where you look. And we saw a decrease in this over the course of float as compared to when individuals were in the film condition. And again, this is kind of where I was mentioning that this gets a little complex in that more often than not, having higher heart rate variability is a good thing. But that's over the course of a day, a life. Being able to have a responsive heart is good. But in a float tank, you don't necessarily have a lot to respond to. Most external sensory information has been completely cut out. And so there's not really a lot for your heart to be responding to. So it would kind of make sense that you would have lower heart rate variability while you're in the pool. The interesting thing is, and this is kind of in the future, is like, how does it affect you later? And that's coming up, hopefully. And then we had blood pressure information. And again, as Justin mentioned yesterday, there was this massive drop in blood pressure, specifically diastolic blood pressure, as compared to the Earth condition when they were watching the film. And now, there are some caveats here. You're in this study in particular, individuals were obviously laying down in the float condition, whereas in the film condition, they were just relaxing in a chair. And that difference in posture can kind of relate to changes in blood pressure. However, the last piece of data I want to show you connects changes in anxiety to this dip in blood pressure in a really interesting way. And this was part of Justin's talk yesterday, but I'm going to walk you through it a bit more specifically. So these graphs are a little confusing, but bear with me. What we are looking at here is changes in serenity. So these changes are what occurred either pre-film to post-film or pre-float to post-float. And down along the bottom is basically their change score. So on this side of the graph, it's people who increased in serenity. And on this side of the graph, it's people who decreased in serenity. But then on this axis of the graph, we have diastolic blood pressure. And so towards the top of the graph would be individuals or time points when they had higher blood pressure, and at the bottom would be lower blood pressure. And all of those dots correspond to our participants. They're in these weird little streaks because it includes all of the time points that occurred in each of the studies. And then these lines are the trend lines that show the relationships between those two pieces of information, diastolic blood pressure and changes in serenity, between the two groups, with the dark orange being, of course, again, the film, and the blue being the float condition. And what we see is really interesting in that the people who increased in serenity over the course of the float tended to have lower blood pressure overall. And that relationship was not there for the film condition. So even though there are caveats to our comparison between the two conditions, something about having lower blood pressure in a float was related to this increase in serenity. And even cooler, we saw this with state anxiety. So again, we're looking at a same kind of plot, diastolic blood pressure up and down, side to side, we've got state anxiety change. So on this side of the graph would be people who increased in anxiety, and this side of the graph would be people who decreased in anxiety. So it's a little reversed from our last graph. And remember, we want people to decrease anxiety. That is the hope, at least. And what we find is that individuals who decreased in anxiety also tended to have lower blood pressure. And it was almost the opposite when you took a look at the film condition. And this is really cool because it connects the anti-anxiety effects of floating with the heart physiology in the moment. And that's huge. Now, what do we have to look forward to, and what just happened? Well, I just told you about how measuring frequencies of heart rate change provides a window into our health. We talked about what frequencies are, how we can measure them at different time scales, how that corresponds to what's going on in the heart, how we can then interpret that information to tell us something about the different body systems, parasympathetic and the sympathetic. We talked about how we can measure other aspects like vagal tone or heart rate variability, and how all of these things go into creating the language that the heart sings every day of our life if we could only listen. And we showed that there is a relationship between those changes that occur in a float tank with changes that happen with anxiety. And so in the future, we're going to do more of this, more measuring things in the float tank, but bring on looking at things post-float tank for hours or days or weeks, understanding how these changes in blood pressure or in frequency during a float experience might be related to changes in overall health on a longer scale as opposed to just before and after float. And we're looking at some of this stuff currently and have a lot of plans in store. So thank you so much for listening. If you want to find me on social media, I'm at Flux and Flux on Instagram and Twitter. I will be in the marble room taking questions. Also, just please stop me. I love talking about this stuff, and I'm really passionate about it. And so if anyone wants to chat or if anything was unclear, there's a ton of stuff I didn't talk about that I could talk about if you wanted to know. But anyway, thanks for listening, you guys. I really appreciate it, and I'll see y'all later.